He thought he owned a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had built it from nothing. He had watched it grow. He had signed the checks, shaken the hands, and taken the credit. And when he decided to walk away from his marriage, he walked out that door with his chin high and his lawyer on speed dial, absolutely certain he held every card in the game. But on a quiet Tuesday morning, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Chicago law firm, a single document slid across a mahogany table. And in the 30 seconds it took his divorce attorney to read that document, every assumption Garrett Weston had ever made about his empire crumbled. If you enjoy stories where betrayal eventually meets karma, where the people who get too comfortable with power forget who helped them build it, make sure you subscribe. Because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how Garrett Weston lost everything in a single Tuesday morning, you have to understand what he and his wife Maren built together, back when they had absolutely nothing. The year was 2009. Garrett was 31 years old, living in a two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of apartment where the radiator knocked in the middle of the night and the parking lot flooded whenever it rained hard. He was working as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a regional freight company. A decent job. Steady pay. Nothing extraordinary. But Garrett had always believed he was meant for something more. He had a dream, one he talked about constantly, sketched on notepads, and pitched to anyone willing to listen. He wanted to build a software platform for small trucking companies. A system that would help independent carriers manage their routes, their drivers, their billing, and their compliance, all in one place. Because he had watched small operators drown in paperwork and inefficiency for years, and he believed he could fix it. The problem was money. Garrett had roughly $4,000 in his savings account. He had student loan debt. He had a credit score that made banks laugh politely and then decline. What he did have was Maren. Maren Caldwell had been with Garrett since their mid-20s. They had met at a mutual friend's backyard cookout. She had laughed at something he said, he had spent the rest of the night trying to make her laugh again, and that was that. She was a licensed physical therapist working at a rehabilitation clinic in Columbus. Not a glamorous job, but a reliable one. She was disciplined, careful with money, and deeply practical, the kind of person who read contracts before signing them and kept a spreadsheet of her monthly expenses. She was also, in every meaningful sense of the word, the reason Garrett had not already given up. When he came home one night with his notepad full of diagrams and told her he wanted to quit his job and build the platform himself, Maren did not say no. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She asked questions. She looked at his notes. She asked more questions. And then she said, "Okay. But we do this carefully." They made a plan together. Maren would keep working full-time to cover their living expenses. Garrett would work on the software nights and weekends while keeping his job, until they had something real, a prototype, some interest, a reason to believe. Maren also quietly began putting aside money. Every month, out of her own paycheck, she contributed to what she called the fund. Not vacation money. Not emergency savings. The company fund. She cut back on everything she could. She stopped getting her hair done at the salon and started watching tutorials online. She packed lunches. She said no to concerts, trips, and dinners out. Month after month, quietly and without complaint, she saved. That detail, small, easy to overlook, would become the most important detail of the entire story. By 2011, Garrett had a working prototype. It was rough. It crashed regularly. The interface was clunky. But it worked, and when he showed it to 3 small trucking operators he knew through his job, 2 of them asked him how soon they could use it. That was enough. He quit his job in March of 2011. Maren held her breath and kept going to work. They used the money she had saved, just over $38,000, to officially launch the company. Here's where the story takes a turn that, at the time, seemed completely ordinary. When it came time to register the business, a conversation happened that neither of them would forget, though they would each remember it very differently, many years later. Garrett had been to see a small business attorney about the structure of the company. The attorney had asked him a few questions, about his credit, about any existing debts, about potential liability exposure. Garrett had some issues. The student loans. A collections account from a medical bill a few years back. Nothing criminal, but the kind of financial history that could create complications, particularly if the company ever needed to seek outside investment or take on commercial contracts that required a clean background check on the owner. The attorney suggested a simple solution. Register the company under Marin's name. She had a clean credit history. No collections. No outstanding judgments. It was a practical, legal, and entirely common move for small businesses in their situation. Garrett brought it home to Marin that evening. They talked about it over dinner. Marin agreed. She signed the paperwork. Her name went on the registration documents. Her name went on the operating agreement. For all legal purposes, Marin Caldwell was the sole owner of Weston Logistics Solutions, LLC. The company was worth nothing at the time. It had 3 clients, a borrowed laptop, and a software platform that still crashed twice a week. Neither of them thought twice about it. That decision, made over pasta on a Tuesday night, treated like a technicality, was the quiet fuse that would burn for the next 11 years. The first 2 years were brutal. There were months when Garrett wondered if he had made a catastrophic mistake. Clients were slow to pay. The software needed constant fixing. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, surviving on coffee and the stubborn conviction that he was right about this idea. Marin kept working. Marin kept covering their bills. And on weekends, when Garrett was too exhausted to think straight, Marin would sit beside him at the kitchen table and help him draft emails, review client feedback, and talk through problems that had no obvious solution. She was not just a financial safety net. She was a partner. But somewhere along the way, gradually, imperceptibly, that partnership began to shift in Garrett's mind. By 2014, the platform had real traction. 23 paying clients. A growing reputation in the regional logistics community. Garrett had hired 2 part-time developers. By 2016, they had over 100 clients across 7 states. Garrett hired a full sales team. They moved into a real office, a modest one, but a real one. Garrett started attending industry conferences. He started wearing better suits. By 2018, Weston Logistics Solutions had crossed $5 million in annual revenue. And Garrett's posture changed. It was subtle at first. The way he talked about the company shifted from "we built" to "I built." The way he described his vision at conferences, passionate, compelling, magnetic, never mentioned Marin. Not once. He started coming home later. Not just from long work days, from dinners, from events, from trips he used to invite her on and then gradually stopped mentioning. He hired a communications firm to manage his personal brand. He was profiled in 2 regional business magazines. In both profiles, he was described as a self-made entrepreneur who built his company from the ground up. Marin was mentioned in one article, briefly, in a single sentence, as his wife. She read that article alone at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. She did not say anything to Garrett about it. But something shifted in her, too. The company kept growing. By 2020, despite the turbulence in the broader economy, Weston Logistics Solutions had expanded to serve clients in 22 states. The platform had been completely overhauled twice. They had 60 full-time employees. A board of directors. Institutional investors who had come in during a Series B funding round in 2019. Garrett had become, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy man. He drove a black Porsche Cayenne. He wore a Rolex he'd bought himself as a birthday present. He had a membership at a private golf club where he entertained clients on weekends. Marin still worked as a physical therapist. She had reduced her hours when the company could afford to support them fully, but she kept working. She liked her work. She liked her patience. It grounded her in a way that Garrett's world, increasingly loud, increasingly performance-driven, no longer did. But her presence in Garrett's world shrank with every passing year. He stopped inviting her to company events. When colleagues asked about her, he would smile and say, "She does her own thing," in a tone that made it sound like a minor inconvenience. At one investor dinner in early 2021, a board member's wife turned to Garrett and asked where Maren was. "Oh, she's not really a business person," Garrett said. He laughed when he said it. Maren was not there to hear it. But the board member's wife was, and she remembered it. Her name was Celeste Hargrove. She had been on the board since the Series B. She was not Garrett's type, too sharp, too observant, too likely to ask follow-up questions. The woman who caught Garrett's attention arrived in the summer of 2021. Her name was Brielle, and she worked for a national logistics trade association as a partnership development director. She was 34, polished, and had the particular kind of professional energy that made people feel simultaneously comfortable and impressed. She and Garrett met at an industry summit in Nashville. They were seated at the same table at a cocktail dinner on the first night. By the end of the conference, they had exchanged numbers. The text started as professional. A follow-up about a potential partnership opportunity. An article one of them had thought the other might find interesting. Then the texts got less professional. Then they stopped pretending entirely. Garrett began traveling more frequently. Business trips he had always taken alone, he now seemed to extend by a day or two. He was vague about his schedule. He was distracted at home, present in body but somewhere else entirely. Maren noticed. She did not confront him immediately. She was careful. Deliberate. The same qualities that had made her such a reliable partner in the early years were still there, she simply aimed them in a different direction now. She started paying closer attention to things she had previously ignored. She paid attention to how Garrett talked about the company. Specifically, how he never once, in any conversation, in any document she could see, in any interview or profile, acknowledged that the company was legally in her name. She paid attention to what that actually meant. And then, quietly, she made an appointment with her own attorney. The attorney's name was Patricia Orville, and she had been practicing family and business law in Columbus for over 20 years. When Maren sat across from her and explained the situation, the company, the registration, the operating agreement, the years of silence, Patricia Orville listened very carefully. Then she pulled up the original incorporation documents. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at Maren. "Do you understand what these say?" Patricia asked. Maren said she thought she did. Patricia walked her through it anyway. The company was registered entirely in Maren's name. The operating agreement listed Maren as the sole member. Garrett had been operating as CEO under an informal arrangement, a title he had given himself, that the board had accepted, but that had never been formally documented in a way that transferred or diluted Maren's underlying ownership. During the Series B funding round, the investors had taken a minority stake, structured as a separate equity class that did not touch Maren's foundational ownership position. In other words, the investors owned a piece of the revenue upside. Maren owned the company. Patricia folded her hands on the desk. "Garrett has been running this company as though he owns it," she said. "But unless you have signed documents that transferred ownership to him, and based on what you've shown me, you have not, the company still belongs to you." Maren sat very still for a moment. "What do I do with that?" she asked quietly. Patricia Orville smiled. Not unkindly, but with the particular steadiness of a person who has seen many versions of this story and knows exactly how they end. "For now," she said, "you wait." 6 months later, Garrett asked for a divorce. He did not do it gently. He did not sit down at the kitchen table, the way they had sat together 1,000 times before. He did not acknowledge what they had built, or what she had sacrificed, or the $38,000 that had come from her savings account and launched a company worth north of $200 million. He delivered the news on a Sunday evening in their living room, standing by the window with his arms crossed. He told Maren he had not been happy for a long time. He told her he thought they had grown in different directions. He told her he thought it was better for both of them. He did not mention Brielle. Maren sat on the couch and listened to every word. Then she said, "Okay. If that's what you want." Garrett had expected tears. He had expected pleading, or rage, or at minimum a long, difficult conversation. He had prepared himself for an exhausting evening. What he got was a quiet woman on a couch, nodding slowly, with an expression he couldn't quite read. He left the house that night feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't name. He called his attorney in the morning. Garrett's attorney was a man named Dale Pruitt, a high-profile divorce and asset protection lawyer with offices in downtown Chicago, chosen specifically because Garrett anticipated a fight over the company. Dale assured him the divorce would be straightforward. The company was the primary asset. Garrett had run it for over a decade. His name was on every decision, every investor agreement, every strategic document. The company bore his last name. Dale believed they would be able to structure a settlement that protected Garrett's controlling interest while offering Maren a reasonable financial package. Maren, of course, had already retained Patricia Orville. The first few weeks of proceedings were quiet. Discovery requests were exchanged. Financial disclosures were submitted. Nothing out of the ordinary. But he didn't know something important. Patricia Orville had been building a document file for 6 months. She had the original incorporation papers. She had the operating agreement, signed by Maren in 2011, with no subsequent transfer documents. She had the Series B term sheet, which carefully preserved the founding members' equity position. She had the board resolution documents, which listed the company's legal owner of record, Maren Caldwell, in a footnote that no one had ever flagged as significant. She also had something else. A certified letter sent to Maren in 2019 by the company's own corporate counsel, during the Series B process, which had confirmed Maren's status as the legal owner of record and asked her to sign a governance acknowledgement. Maren had signed it. The document had been filed. No one had told Garrett about it, because no one had thought it mattered. That letter was the cleanest piece of evidence in the file. Patricia submitted the complete document package to the court 3 weeks into the proceedings. On a Tuesday morning, at 9:14 a.m., Dale Pruitt opened the digital filing on his laptop. He read for 2 minutes. Then he called Garrett. "I need you to come to my office," Dale said. "I'm in the middle of..." "Now, Garrett. Please." Garrett arrived at the office 40 minutes later. Dale met him in the lobby and walked him directly to a conference room. Not his usual corner office. The conference room. A paralegal came in with a stack of documents. Dale set them on the table. He pushed the original incorporation papers across the mahogany surface. Garrett looked at them. He had not seen these papers in over 11 years. He had signed them once, or rather, he had been present when Maren signed them, which was a different thing entirely. In the chaos of those early days, in the blur of building something from nothing, the legal paperwork had felt like a formality. A box to check. He stared at Maren's signature. "What am I looking at?" he said. "You're looking at the reason this divorce is not going to go the way you expected," Dale said. He walked Garrett through every document, one by one. Garrett's face went through several stages. Confusion first. Then dismissal. Surely this was fixable, surely there was something they could do. Then a slow, terrible understanding. There had been no transfer of ownership. There had been no documentation reassigning shares. Garrett had run the company, had made the decisions, had been the face of the brand, but none of that, legally, constituted ownership. He had been operating as CEO of a company he did not own. The company that bore his name. The company he had introduced himself with at every conference, every investor dinner, every media interview for 11 years. He did not own it. "Can we challenge this?" Garrett asked. Dale was quiet for a moment. "We can try," he said carefully. "But I have to be honest with you. The documentation is very clean. The 2019 letter from corporate counsel is particularly damaging. It confirms her status as owner of record, and she signed an acknowledgement. In court, that's going to be very difficult to overcome." Garrett sat back in his chair. "If you've made it this far, drop a comment below and tell me what you think he deserves." Because what happens next shocked everyone, including people who had worked with Garrett for years. The news moved fast. Corporate proceedings are not always private. Word began to circulate in the Columbus and Chicago business communities that there was a dispute over the ownership of Weston Logistics Solutions. Whispers reached the board of directors. Celeste Hargrove, the board member who had asked Garrett about Marin at that investor dinner 2 years earlier, called an emergency session. The board convened in Chicago on a Thursday morning. They reviewed the documentation. They brought in their own legal counsel. The assessment was unambiguous: Marin Caldwell was the legal owner of the company. The board had been operating under an informal arrangement that had no formal legal basis. Garrett's CEO title had never been accompanied by the kind of ownership documentation that should have underpinned it. They voted. It was not close. Garrett Weston was removed as CEO of Weston Logistics Solutions. He was informed via a letter delivered to his downtown Chicago apartment, the new apartment he had moved into after leaving the house he and Marin had shared. He received the letter on a Friday afternoon. He was told that his access to company systems would be revoked at end of business that day. When he drove to the office he had chosen, the lease he had signed, the building he had walked into 6 days a week for years, there were 2 security guards in the lobby. They were polite. They were professional. But they did not let him past the front desk. Garrett Weston stood in the lobby of his own company and was escorted to collect a box of personal items from his office. His black Porsche Cayenne was in the parking garage. He drove home alone. The weeks that followed were, by all accounts, difficult ones for Garrett. He retained 2 additional attorneys. He filed a motion challenging the ownership structure. He argued that his decade of operational control, his role as the public face of the company, his contributions to its growth, all of it should constitute an equitable claim to the business. The argument had some emotional logic to it. It had very little legal logic. The court found in Marin's favor on the primary ownership question. The judge noted that the documentation was exceptionally clear, that Marin had signed a governance acknowledgement as recently as 2019, and that Garrett had never taken formal steps to transfer or formalize his own interest. What Garrett did receive was a settlement, structured to acknowledge his contributions. It was not nothing. It was a significant sum. But it was not the company. He received a financial package, a clean exit, and a non-disparagement agreement. Marin received Weston Logistics Solutions. What happened next was something the business community did not fully expect. There had been concern, quiet, polite concern, the kind that gets discussed in hushed tones at board dinners, about what Marin's formal assumption of control would mean for the company. She was not a logistics software executive. She had not run operations. She had not managed teams of 60 people or navigated institutional investor relationships. What those concerns missed was something that had been true for a very long time. Marin had been paying attention for 11 years. She had been present, even when Garrett stopped inviting her. She had read the quarterly reports that came to her as owner of record. She had sat on calls with the corporate attorneys during the Series B process. She had, quietly and without fanfare, educated herself about the business in ways that no one had noticed because no one had thought to look. And she had something else, the respect of several key people inside the company who had quietly found Garrett's behavior in recent years difficult to defend. She promoted 2 internal leaders she trusted. She brought in a seasoned COO with 15 years of logistics technology experience. She restructured the board to include 2 additional independent members with strong governance backgrounds. She was not trying to prove a point. She was trying to run a company. Within 18 months of her assumption of full control, Weston Logistics Solutions had expanded into the Canadian market, signed a landmark partnership agreement with a major national carrier, and received an acquisition offer from a private equity firm at a valuation that was more than double what it had been at the time of the divorce proceedings. Maren did not accept the acquisition offer. She was not ready to sell. She had barely started. Garrett Weston, in the months and years that followed, faded from the professional landscape that had once celebrated him. He tried to launch a new venture, a consulting firm, positioned around his logistics industry expertise. It struggled to find traction. The industry is not large. The story of how he had lost Weston Logistics Solutions had made the rounds. Potential clients were cautious. Potential partners had questions. The relationship with betrayal did not survive the first year. Without the status, the Porsche, and the corner office, the connection between them had very little to stand on. He moved from the Chicago apartment to a smaller place in a suburb of Columbus. He was closer to home now, in a geographic sense, but very far from the life he had imagined. He gave a short interview to a local business podcast about a year after the divorce was finalized. The host asked him what he had learned. He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "I convinced myself that because I was doing the most visible work, I was doing all the work. And I was wrong about that." It was the most honest thing anyone had heard him say in years. Maren, for her part, did not speak publicly about the divorce or its aftermath for a long time. When she finally agreed to a profile in a national business publication, more than 2 years after she had assumed full control of Weston Logistics Solutions, she spoke carefully. She talked about the early years of the company. About the fund she had built from her paychecks. About the nights she had sat at the kitchen table helping Garrett draft emails when he was too exhausted to think straight. About the attorney's advice in 2011 and the paperwork she had signed without much ceremony, in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Columbus. She talked about what it had felt like to watch her contribution become invisible. She talked about the moment. Sitting across from Patricia Orville in that quiet law office, when she had first understood what she actually held in her hands. The journalist asked her whether she had planned the entire thing. Whether the calm she had shown the night Garrett announced he was leaving had been strategic. Maren smiled. "I didn't plan anything," she said. "I just never signed something I didn't need to sign." There is a version of this story that ends with satisfaction. With a clean moral, a tidy lesson, a sense that the scales balanced themselves perfectly. The truth is more complicated and more human than that. Garrett Weston was not purely a villain. He was a man who got lost, who let success rewrite his memory of how he got there, who confused visibility with contribution, who made the ancient and common mistake of believing that the person doing the loudest work was doing all the work. And Maren Caldwell was not purely a victim waiting to be vindicated. She was a woman who had made deliberate choices for years, to stay present, to stay informed, to sign the right documents and not sign the wrong ones, and to wait patiently for the moment when the truth she had always known would finally have room to become undeniable. The $11,000 she had quietly set aside in year 1. The $38,000 in savings that launched the company. The governance acknowledgement she had signed in 2019, confirming what had always been true. The attorney she had retained 6 months before Garrett told her he wanted a divorce. None of these things were accidents. None of them were spite. They were the actions of a woman who understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone around her, what it means to build something real, and what it costs when the people you build it with stop seeing you. The company still operates today under the name Weston Logistics Solutions. Garrett's name remains on the letterhead. No one has moved to change it. Maren has said, in private conversations reported by people close to her, that she doesn't see the point. The name doesn't matter, she is said to have told a colleague once. The documents do. There is a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Chicago law firm where a document slid across a mahogany table on a Tuesday morning and changed everything. It was not a dramatic document. It was not written in anger. It was not the product of a conspiracy or a trap. It was a piece of paper signed over a decade earlier, in a two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Columbus, by a woman who read contracts before signing them. It said her name. Just her name. And that was enough. The biggest mistake Garrett Weston ever made was forgetting whose name was on the empire.